As you've probably figured out, for economists, an awful lot of ideas and concepts go back to Adam Smith. In his great work, The Wealth of Nations, written back in 1776, Smith was quite eloquent on the possible benefits of competition between firms guided in the pursuit of profit and self-interest. But Smith was also a thoughtful, hard-headed guy, and he knew that firms would often seek to avoid competition too. Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices." In this lecture, we want to discuss antitrust and anti-competitive behavior, and what the federal government can do to prevent firms from coming together in a way that might raise prices and injure the public, and instead to encourage firms to compete with each other. The primary federal agencies that carry out antitrust and competition policy are the Federal Trade Commission and the U.S. Department of Justice. The Federal Trade Commission is an independent agency. It reports to Congress. It's headed by 5 commissioners. The commissioners are nominated by the President, subject to confirmation by the Senate. They serve 7-year terms, and no more than 3 of the commissioners on the Federal Trade Commission can be from one political party. In the U.S. Department of Justice, there's one element, one branch of the U.S. Department of Justice that has an antitrust division and actually does the prosecution in many antitrust cases. Now, the total budget for both the FTC and the antitrust division in the Department of Justice is not very large, at least not large by the standards of the federal budget, which exceeds $2 trillion a year. The total costs for antitrust enforcement for these agencies is maybe on the order of about $150 million per year. One main task of the competition authorities is to check that firms aren't merging their way into monopoly. Now, the U.S. economy has lots and lots of mergers where 2 big companies join together. There was a big wave of merger activity in the late 1990s. In 1999 and again in 2000, there were about 10,000 or 11,000 mergers each of those years, with a market value each year of something like $3.4 trillion. Even when mergers slacked off some in the early 2000s. In 2003, there were 7,700 mergers with a market value of about $1.3 trillion. So there are lots of mergers happening every year across the U.S. economy where 2 firms join together. Now, under law, the federal government has the power to review mergers before they happen. And this is how that process works. The federal government under law, reviews any merger or acquisition when one firm acquires another, where at least one of the firms is above a minimum size of $100 million or more in sales. In that case, the merger has to be reported to the government before it happens. Now, the point here is not the U.S. government is hostile to mergers. As the Federal Trade Commission says on its website, most mergers actually benefit competition and consumers by allowing firms to operate more efficiently. But the FTC also continues on its website, some mergers are likely to lessen competition. That in turn can lead to higher prices, reduced availability of goods or services, lower quality of products, and less innovation. Indeed, some mergers create a concentrated market, while others enable a single firm to raise prices. Now, this balanced view seems just about right. After all, the U.S. has a fundamentally free market economy. People who run firms have the freedom to make all sorts of choices about who to hire, what to invest in, what to produce, whether to buy or sell property, whether to buy or sell equipment. They will make some of those choices wisely, and in some cases, they'll make some of those choices foolishly. But the overall philosophy behind a free market economy is that it is better for the economy and it is better for the firms if people who run those companies make those individual decisions, rather than having, say, the government or some agency try to second-guess all of those decisions. So most of the time, we're going to let people make decisions about mergers, but in some cases, the government's going to review them and check them out. Now, of those perhaps 7, 8, 10,000 mergers that happen a year, about 200 mergers a year generate a request from the government for more information. That sort of officially means we're investigating your merger. And when the government has requested more information, then there are three possible outcomes. One is the government can simply block the merger and say it's not allowed. A second possibility is it can allow the merger and just say, go ahead, we think it's fine after some consideration. And a third and fairly common outcome is the government can say, okay, we'll allow it, but we'll set some conditions. And often those conditions might be, you two firms can merge, but one of the firms has to spin off part of itself into a separate and independent firm. It's also possible that firms can engage in anti-competitive behavior without actually merging with each other. The Federal Trade Commission has the task of deciding whether certain business strategies are anti-competitive, and then asking as an enforcement agency to prevent those strategies from being used. We'll get into these anti-competitive strategies later on, so I don't want to go too far into that right now. But let me just say that in some cases, anti-competitive behavior looks pretty obvious, but many other cases, it might look obvious in some situations, but not in other situations, and it gets very difficult to define where tough competition stops and anti-competitive behavior starts. So save that idea on your mental radar. We'll come back to anti-competitive behavior later on in this lecture. The first task of antitrust enforcement requires defining how much competition exists in a market. You have to have some way of saying that. And then figuring out how or whether to respond if there doesn't seem to be enough competition. So, how do you measure the amount of competition in a market? Here's one simple-minded way, it's referred to as a four-firm concentration ratio. Let's imagine a market with four firms, and each of them has 25% of the market. Two of them want to merge with each other. So there's four firms, two of them want to merge. Should you block this merger on the grounds that would be not enough competition, or should you let it happen? How would you measure it? How would you think about that competition and what's happening with the firm? Well, this isn't just sort of a hypothetical example. Late in 1998, to give an example I mentioned before, the Exxon Corporation and Mobil Oil announced they were going to merge together to form a single large firm. Both companies were enormous. Exxon at that time had 80,000 employees and total revenues of something like $137 billion per year. Mobil had 42,000 employees and revenues of $66 billion a year. If, in 1998, you'd ranked all the companies in the United States according to sales, Exxon was the fourth largest at the time the merger was announced, and Mobil was the 13th largest company. So here are two extremely large companies that want to merge. Do you allow that, or do you not allow that? How can you measure how much competition there is? Now, let's think about this idea of the four-firm concentration ratio. A four-firm concentration ratio is calculated by adding up the market shares of the four largest firms in a certain industry. So, for example, let's say that there are 10 firms, and they each have 10% of total sales in the industry. 10 firms, each with 10% of total sales. So if you took the four biggest firms, the four-firm ratio would be 40%. And obviously, if the four-firm ratio was 90%, there's not very much competition in that industry. If the four-firm ratio is 10%, then there are lots and lots of little firms in the industry. So the four-firm ratio is a good, quick, and dirty way of talking about industries and how much competition there is. But it's not a complete way or not a perfect way, and to help understand why, consider two different industries or two different types of competition. In one industry, there's one large firm that has 77% of the market, and 23 little firms that have 1% each. So if you calculate the four-firm ratio for that industry, you'd take the 77 of the big firm plus 3 of the little firms, and the four-firm ratio would be 80%. Now imagine another industry, and it has 4 firms, and they have 20% each. 4 firms with 20% each of the market, and then 4 more firms that have 5% each of the market. So there's a total of 8 firms in the industry, and again, the four-firm ratio is 80%, because you take the big 4 firms and add them together. So in these two examples, the four-firm ratio is exactly the same. But the picture of competition would actually be somewhat different. The first case, with the mega firm that has 77% of the market, is really pretty close to monopoly. One giant firm and a bunch of little firms. The second case, with 4 big firms and then 4 sort of medium-sized firms, may actually have a fairly decent level of competition. The 4-firm ratio doesn't really distinguish between those two. So while the 4-firm ratio is a good starting point, a good quick and dirty measure, you need a measure of competition that distinguishes a little more carefully between these various cases. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index is another measure of the concentration of a market. And to calculate a Herfindahl-Hirschman index, what you do is take the market share of each firm, square it, and then add up the sum of the squares. So if you take the idea, square the market shares, and then sum up the square of those market shares, you'll get a number. Now, how would that work? Let's think that through for a moment. Imagine that at one extreme you have a monopoly with 100% of the market. Then the Herfindahl-Hirschman index would be 100 squared, which would be 10,000. At another extreme, imagine a market with 1,000 small firms. 1,000 small firms, each with 1/10 of 1% of the market. So if you square 1/10 of 1% and you add it up for all 1,000 firms, you would get a total of 10. So a highly, highly competitive market will have a Herfindahl-Hirschman number that's very low. Something that's a monopoly at the extreme would have a Herfindahl-Hirschman of 10,000. And the HHI, as economists call it, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, will be somewhere between 0 or a very low number and 10,000. The general rule that the Federal Trade Commission has sort of followed in the past is, look at the industry after a proposed merger. If after a proposed merger, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index was less than 1,000, the Federal Trade Commission would probably just approve the merger. If the merger would result in a Herfindahl-Hirschman index that was more than 1,800, they would probably challenge the merger and either block it or perhaps allow it with some conditions. And if a merger would result in a Herfindahl-Hirschman index between 1,000 and 1,800, then the Federal Trade Commission would sort of scrutinize it and make a case-by-case decision depending on what the rest of the market looked like. Now, if you play with the market share numbers a little bit, you can kind of see that if a merger resulted in a firm getting something like 40% of the market, then it's likely to be considered very carefully or perhaps blocked. If a merger results in a firm getting perhaps 50% of the market, it's almost certain to be blocked. So, roughly speaking, that's kind of where the Herfindahl-Hirschman index takes you. However, in the last decade or so, perhaps 15 or 20 years, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice have been moving away from this kind of mechanical measuring of market shares. And the reason is that defining a market can actually be rather difficult. Now, it's a term we've been using through all these lectures, but actually it's a little tricky when it comes to antitrust enforcement. And the problem is, do you think of a market in a very broad sense or in a very narrow sense? When firms are talking about competition, firms often claim, oh, we're just a tiny little fish in a very big pond. You know, we're a small player in a very big market. And the competition authorities, like the Federal Trade Commission, tend to argue actually the firm is a pretty big fish in a fairly small market, in a fairly small pond. The classic case here is the cellophane case. And this is actually a Supreme Court case back in 1956. The DuPont company was accused of monopolizing cellophane production. And they had at that time about 70% of the market for cellophane. So the government said, you've got 70% of the market for cellophane. Therefore, you're a monopoly, and we're going to force you in one way or another to expand competition in the cellophane market. DuPont said, sure, we've got 70% of the market for cellophane, but cellophane isn't the right way to define this market. Really, cellophane is part of a bigger market for flexible packaging materials that includes waxed paper and all sorts of stuff. And in the market for flexible packaging materials, we have less than 20% of the market. And in 1956, the Supreme Court agreed with DuPont that the broader definition of the market was in this case appropriate. A similar case or a similar problem came up in the Microsoft case in the 1990s. In the Microsoft case, Microsoft had maybe 80% or more of the market for operating systems for computers. But is the right way to think about the market operating systems? In the overall software market, if you include the game market and all those companies like Nintendo and PlayStation, Microsoft had a much, much smaller share of the overall software market. And so Microsoft argued, actually, we're just a relatively small fish in this big pond of software. While the government argued, you're a big fish if we define the market as operating systems. And in that particular case, the courts ended up agreeing with the prosecution that the market should be defined more narrowly. So this question of how you define the market obviously gets very important if you're going to try and use a four-firm concentration ratio or a Herfindahl-Hirschman index. In some ways, the definition of the market is more important. That determines the outcome of whether there's a lot of competition or not. Another issue that's come up a lot in the last few years in particular is that if you define the market in terms of global competition, then firms are going to tend to look less dominant than if the market is defined as competition only within a certain country. Should you focus on the domestic market or the international market? For example, think about the automobile market. The United States essentially has now two big domestic auto producers, General Motors and Ford. Chrysler is now entirely owned by a German company, and all the other companies like Toyota and so on that have operations in the United States are owned abroad. But nonetheless, even though there are very few big U.S. automakers or U.S.-owned automakers, competition in the U.S. auto industry is much greater than it was 30 years ago because of all the imports. It would be crazy to say that General Motors monopolizes the U.S. market, given the competition it faces from the rest of the world. Especially if you're in a smaller country, you want to be very careful about measuring only domestic concentration. In the ExxonMobil case, the combination of these factors allowed the merger to happen. Exxon and Mobil are both huge oil companies, but arguably the energy market is a lot bigger than the oil market. Also, from a world point of view, if you compare Exxon and Mobil to the big national oil producers like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria and Venezuela, even Exxon and Mobil could hardly be said to dominate the market. And so in that sense, defining the market as the world market, letting Exxon and Mobil merge together made perfect sense. An alternative method to measure competition between firms is to look at prevailing prices where firms compete directly with each other, instead of just looking at the market shares. And the classic example here is a case of where two office supply stores, Staples and Office Depot, proposed to merge with each other. This happened in 1997. Staples and Office Depot said, look, we want to merge. And if you look at our two stores together, we've only got about 6% of the market for office supplies. After all, if you think about it, almost every grocery store and drugstore sells office supplies. We've only got 6% of the office supplies market. And if you look at it in terms of concentration, then you should probably just let them merge. Of course, if you said, well, we're going to define the market as superstores, then those two would have had a larger share of the market. But again, how do you define the market here? Well, rather than even getting into that entire dispute, the government regulators at the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice looked at data from the automatic checkout scanners in both stores that show the prices and the quantities sold at all the individual stores. And when they analyzed that data, they found that prices at Staples were higher in towns that didn't have an Office Depot. So when there wasn't the competition from the other superstore, they in effect were able to charge more. And based on that evidence of what prices were actually being charged in different cities and different towns, they blocked the proposed merger. Now, along with blocking mergers that could lead to a reduced level of competition, the antitrust authorities also have the power to break up large firms. And there are, of course, some classic historical examples here. In the early 1910s, just after 1910, the antitrust authorities, in one of the first big tests of their strength, broke up the Standard Oil Company into a bunch of different companies. They broke up the American Tobacco Company. More recently, in the 1980s, the AT&T, the phone company, was broken up into what are sometimes called the Baby Bell companies, the local companies that provided phone services, what was then called Bell Labs, and also a long-distance phone company. The antitrust authorities tried to break up IBM for many, many years and failed, and then IBM actually sold off some of its parts in a way that was almost like it was breaking up. And of course, more recently, there were proposals to break up Microsoft. But modern courts have been really quite hesitant to just break up a company. It can be just incredibly disruptive to a firm if it's broken into pieces. And if you take one successful firm and you create three money-losing firms that shed jobs and cost shareholders money right and left, it's just not clear that that's good social policy. But the breakup of AT&T, which I think really has worked out pretty well, does show that in some cases breaking up a big monopoly can be a sensible thing to do. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's also a category of behavior by companies that falls short of becoming a monopoly and falls short of merging into a monopoly, but nonetheless seems like anti-competitive behavior. Let me give you some examples. In a price-fixing cartel, a group of producers are each staying as independent companies, but they also agree to set their output and prices all together. And that way they act like a monopoly. And so a cartel, specifically, is defined as a group of producers who agree to act together in setting prices and output. In the late 1990s, the antitrust regulators prosecuted one international cartel of vitamin manufacturers. It included the Swiss firm Hoffmann-La Roche, the German firm BASF, and the French firm Rhône-Poulenc. These firms had been meeting in hotel rooms to reach agreements on how much to produce and how much to charge, and even which firms would sell to which customers. And then the higher-priced vitamins were bought by firms like General Mills and Kellogg and Purina Mills and Procter & Gamble, which pushed up the prices of the vitamin products for people and animals. Hoffmann-La Roche pleaded guilty in 1999 and agreed to pay a fine of $500 million. And at least one top executive at the company served 4 months of jail time. In the early 2000s, the U.S. government was actively investigating about 30 different possible cartels. One of the most famous prosecutions of a cartel, or at least it's famous among the sort of people I end up having lunch with, was the lysine case. Lysine is an additive to vegetable or to animal feed. About 5 big producers in the world make lysine, and it turned out these producers were literally meeting in hotel rooms and agreeing to set the price and quantity. We know this for a fact because the Department of Justice got one participant in these meetings to become an informant, and they bugged the rooms. So I've actually seen the surveillance tapes of these meetings. The overcharges to U.S. customers in lysine were estimated at something like $1 billion a year. In one of the tapes, in one of the surveillance tapes, the guy who was president of Archer Daniels Midland tells a big executive from his largest competitor that Archer Daniels Midland has an official corporate slogan. And he says this slogan has penetrated the whole company. And the slogan is, "Our competitors are our friends. Our customers are the enemy." That could be the slogan of cartels everywhere. Our competitors are our friends and our customers are the enemy. Cartels are illegal. But when the act crosses international borders, it's not always clear how to enforce it. For example, is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries illegal because it gets together to set oil prices? Under whose law is it illegal exactly? But cartel enforcement is beginning to go across international lines a lot more, as in these vitamin and lysine cases. A variety of other restrictive business practices might limit competition and bring some enforcement as well. Let me sort of walk through some of the possible terms. They include price maintenance agreements, exclusive dealing, tie-in sales, and predatory pricing, but that's just words. Let's just walk through what they are one at a time. A price maintenance agreement happens when a product manufacturer is selling to a group of dealers, and then they sell on to the general public. It's an illegal price maintenance agreement if the manufacturer demands the dealers to sell for at least a certain minimum price, because it would block competition between the dealers. But the counterargument here is, imagine that you're a manufacturer making something like expensive cameras, and you want to sell them to retailers who will really give good customer service for your cameras. You don't want a situation where someone gets lousy service at some cut-rate retailer and then blames you because you've really made good cameras. So why can't you sell just to high-end stores that give high service and encourage them to charge a high price? Well, as it turns out, under law, the manufacturer is legally allowed to suggest a minimum price and to stop selling to dealers who regularly undercut the suggested price, but they're not allowed to require a minimum price. If you think that's a pretty subtle distinction, you're right, of course. An exclusive dealing arrangement between a manufacturer and a dealer requires the dealers sell only products from one manufacturer. Now, an exclusive dealing arrangement can be legal if the purpose is to encourage competition between dealers. For example, it's perfectly legal for the Ford Motor Company only to sell new cars to Ford dealers, and GM only to sell cars to GM dealers, and so on. But exclusive deals can also limit competition. If there was one large electronics retailer, one superstore, that got the exclusive right to be the sole distributor of certain kinds of televisions and computers and audio equipment from a bunch of different companies, then that kind of exclusive contract would have an anti-competitive effect on other retailers. A tie-in sale is a situation where a customer is only allowed to buy one product if the customer also buys another product. Now, these are sometimes illegal. For example, imagine that a store said, if you want to buy one CD that's really popular, you have to buy two others at the same time. We'll only sell you a 3-pack. But in other cases, tie-in sales or bundling, this is sometimes called, is perfectly legal. For example, when you buy season tickets to a sports team or a set of plays, that's a package of tickets. You might be buying it just so you can go to the few shows or games that are likely to sell out, but that's why you get them. Computer software can also bundle together a number of different programs, even if the buyer only wants a couple of those programs. Predatory pricing is another example of anti-competitive behavior. That happens when the existing firm reacts to a new firm by cutting the price very low for a time until the new firm is driven out of the market and then raising the price again back to a monopoly level. Obviously, this pattern of pricing is aimed at discouraging the entry of new firms into the market. But in practice, it's really hard to figure out when pricing is predatory. Say that a certain airline is flying back and forth between two cities, and a new airline starts flying back and forth, but at a lower price. If the incumbent airline cuts its price to match the entrant, is that predatory pricing? Or is that just market competition at work? It's not obvious, is it? A commonly proposed rule is that if a firm is selling for less than its costs, then you should say it's doing predatory pricing. But in a free market, prices are set by supply and demand, not by cost, and it's not unusual to see stuff sold in a dollar store somewhere for less than cost, so why should cost even be relevant to this question? Moreover, accounting being what it is, calculating what's a real cost and what does something really cost is often not an obvious calculation either. Overall, all of these theories of exclusive dealing, predatory pricing, and all the rest may seem a little squishy and uncertain, and truth is they are. Usually, some cases are clearly anti-competitive and some are clearly not, and there's a gray area in between, which is less than ideal. It would always be better if the law was clear-cut, not gray, but it doesn't seem avoidable to have some grayness. There's also, with all of this, a lively ongoing intellectual debate over whether markets should be highly regulated by antitrust authorities or not, whether competition will usually win or whether it might not always win, and whether government intervention is necessary to encourage more competition. The case for backing off antitrust enforcement, except in very extreme cases, goes like this. Cartels often come under pressure from cheaters. Cartels will often have a situation where one member of the cartel decides to sell more, and so the cartel will fold. Monopoly will come under pressure from new competitors. If there are big profits to be made, people are going to try and enter. Many of these practices that look anti-competitive or restrictive may actually be useful, and if they aren't, they'll be competed away over time. Also, it can be hard to measure the benefits of antitrust, because in many cases, markets evolve, and it's hard to say whether the antitrust enforcement really helped or really didn't. In other cases, maybe you prosecute one company for antitrust and you deter other firms, but you deterred them so they never did anything bad, and it's hard to measure how beneficial the antitrust enforcement was. Ultimately, we want firms to focus on making innovative, new, useful products. We don't want firms to focus on guessing what the government competition regulators are going to decide. Moreover, it's worth remembering, government regulators sometimes decide for non-economic reasons. They might get political pressure from state legislatures. If a firm in state A wants to buy a firm in state B, is that good or bad? Maybe depends on what your state legislators think about it. Well, most of those in favor of having less antitrust are economists, and I think I'll just sort of assume that most people listening to these lectures tend to think of themselves as people who like enforcing antitrust, and they believe that you should really go after big companies that are blocking the market. So if you're that kind of person, let me give you a hard question. What about the U.S. Postal Service? It's a monopoly. All around the world, other countries have broken up their national mail monopolies and allowed greater competition in the delivery of the mail. Of all the high-income countries in the world, in Europe, Japan, Canada, the U.S. probably has the least competition in its postal service of any of them. Now, before you start telling me all the problems with breaking up the post office, remember, there are a lot of problems with breaking up AT&T and Microsoft, too. If you're an antitrust supporter, you want to be hesitant before saying you can't break things up. As I say, post office has already been broken up in Germany and Sweden and lots of other countries. They've worked out the problems. So if you think of yourself as favoring strong antitrust enforcement, what about breaking up the post office? Or are you not quite as secure about breaking up big companies as you were a minute or two ago?